Hey folks, welcome back. It's it was lightning earlier, lightning, um, but now it's starting to rain, and hopefully I don't lose power or internet or anything like that. That would disrupt this recording. Um, so yeah, let's get to it. We're just gonna keep doing this stuff. Trying to share the screen. Cool. So is the visible or the intelligible clear to the mind? Um, Number one, how does the form of the good illuminate experience? We answered that last time. Three ways. The form of the good first and foremost makes it possible to know things, makes really any existence possible. Um, and in the second instance, is the cause of that existence and is the cause of not only the knowability, but the truths. Not nobility, but knowability, the ability to be known of truth. That's the first thing. The second thing is the truth itself, the causation of the truth. And the third thing is that you can study the good just like you can study the sun. There was some, discussion of the good being superior to knowledge and truth both. Um, William James actually has the same idea. For him, truth is a reflexive process of what is good and molding your understanding of language and utility and action and behavior, all in a reflexive adaptation of what survives and what sustains. For him, truth is a crossing or a transformation um, between how do you have a teacher look to Winchester? Because uh, it's a passageway between territories. How do you get from one room to another? How do you get from one truth to another? From one person, one version of yourself to another? Anyway, that's James. That's not Plato. We're doing Plato right now. So, yeah, those are the three ways we did them last time. Is the visible or the intelligible clear to the mind? Similarly to like intuition versus analysis, intuition is clearer than analysis. It does more than what analysis can do. And is the intelligible is clear to the mind. The dialectic is like intuition. It changes, it is fleeting. It alights across truths, illuminates them, adapts to them, fits on them, and keeps moving, constantly growing. Um, Constantly cutting your teeth and improving your ability to know things and perceive truth. So we'll read the analogy of the divided line for that. The analogy of the divided line, um, sorry, it's storming. I got distracted. The analogy of the divided line involves two foldings, so to speak. You take a line, you fold it in half. Not really in half, it's more like one third and two thirds. But then you do that division again for each of those segments. And so I guess you'd get one ninth, two ninths, um, two ninths, and then four ninths. Yeah. And basically the dialectic, the understanding at the very end, the four ninths, ends up being not as big as all the other ones, but close to it. It's just under half, makes up just under half of it. The genuine understanding, not the concept, which is the third. That's the fourth level. So there are four levels. You should be able to see, let me see what you can see. Yep. So you can kind of see the four levels here, but here are some more pictures of the flower metaphor, if you want to see those. I drew them for multiple classes. And here's, I think, like the cleanest presentation of the analogy of the divided line. It's in the text too. They give you an actual visual in the text. So, and yeah, it's about 1/9, 2/9, 2/9, and they are equal measure, and then 4/9. Not sure if they're doing ninths or not. Into two unequal sections, right? So it could be 1 to 3, it could be 1 to 2. 1/3 is could be one. I think they might be doing 1/4. No. Here, I can kind of measure this on the screen. Yeah, I mean, I think it's about, it's actually just short of 1/3. So the bottom, the way they've drawn it, this physical world is a little bit more than 1/3 of the line. On an index card at the size I have it, it was, anyway, it doesn't matter. Um, I like rain. I find it soothing. So if it's being picked up in the recording, hopefully it's just a lovely ambiance. Um, so here's where we'll start. Understand then that, as we said, there are these two things, one sovereign of the intelligible kind in place, the other of the visible. I don't say of heaven so as not to seem to you to be playing the sophist with the name. In any case, you have two kinds of thing, visible and intelligible. Right. It is like a line divided into two unequal sections. Then divide each section, namely that of the visible and that of the intelligible, in the same ratio as the line. In terms now of relative clarity and opacity, one subsection of the visible consists of images. And by images, I mean first, shadows, then reflections in water, and in all close packed, smooth, and shiny materials, and everything of that sort, if you understand. I do. In the other subsection of the visible, put all the originals of these images, namely the animals around us, all the plants, and the whole class of manufactured things. Consider them put. Would you be willing to say that, as regards truth and untruth, the division is in this proportion? As the opinable is to the knowable, so the likeness is to the thing that it is like. Certainly. Consider now how the section of the intelligible is to be divided. So here we've got a lot of separation. We've got representation, got a mirroring of perception onto a world that we're somehow detached from. These are things that Plato operates on, but really want to push back against them in this class. There is no representation in an immanent materialist monism, even one of differentiation as the core driving force and novelty as its ever increasing generation. Um, Certainly. Consider now how the section of the intelligible is to be divided. How? As follows. In one subsection, the soul, using as images the things that were imitated before, is forced to investigate from hypotheses. So this is the third section of concepts. And so you start with a principle or an assumption or some kind of statement or sentence or truth. From there, you can deduce other things. The dialectic and the understanding and the intellect don't need any of that. They navigate back to the first principle, perceive of themselves, and then operate. So, investigate from hypotheses, proceeding not to a first principle, but to a conclusion. In the other subsection, however, it makes its way to a first principle that is not a hypothesis, proceeding from a hypothesis but without the images used in the previous subsection, using forms themselves and making its investigation through them. I don't yet fully understand what you mean. What do you mean? It's a meme. If you don't know the meme, then I can't help you if you're not cool. Let's try again. You'll understand it more easily after the following preamble. I think you know that students of geometry, calculation, and the like hypothesize the odd and the even, the various figures, the three kinds of angles, and other things akin to these in each of their investigations, as if they knew them. They make these their hypotheses and don't think it necessary to give any account to them, either to themselves or to others, as if they were clear to everyone. And going from these first principles through the remaining steps, they arrive in full agreement. But why those first principles? I certainly know that much. And you also know that although they use visible figures and make claims about them, their thought isn't directed to them, but to those other things that they are like. They make their claims for the sake of square itself and the diagonal itself, not the diagonal they draw, and similarly with the others. So, for example, you can see lots of books, lots of different rectangles, lots of different shapes. Or for, let's say you get, we can move through the line, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Um, to see those others themselves that one cannot see except by means of thought. All right. So, yeah, this book, no copyright infringement intended. It's a great book. I'm not going to say what it is, but this book is of a certain dimension, and this book is of a different dimension. Um, Now, the two different books, we may not even know that they're rectangular prisms, so to speak, until we've seen multiple angles. So you just see the back, and then you see the spine, then you see the other side of the spine, difference the top spine, bottom spine, front, etc. And you see the fluidity between those, and you get enough of those, like, they're not really partials because you're actually experiencing them in a continuous movement, as Bergson would show us. But for Plato, they're partials. You get images, shadows, and reflections, like he says, just one-dimensional, two-dimensional things, a plane, a flat plane. Once you get enough flat planes, you create a three-dimensional perception, an object. Um, Once you get enough objects, you can create another recursive integration, another integral of the different sets, of the different objects in the set, up to a principle for that set, basically. So you see enough multi-dimensions of books, then you've seen enough books, right? You've seen enough books from enough angles, then you've seen enough books. And if you've seen enough different books, then you have, maybe you've seen other kinds of rectangular prisms, like, um, or maybe you know other things about books. Maybe you know that books are things where sentences are written and knowledge is stored and history is stored. You know these facts about books. Maybe those are also in the realm of concept. But we're pretty mathematical in Plato's terms, so it's helpful to talk about something else that has a rectangular prism structure. So like my external hard drive is also a rectangular prism. It's plugged in, so I'm not going to put it on camera. But my phone is not quite a rectangular prism, but it's pretty close. Um, these index cards are definitely rectangular prisms. They're just very flat, but there's actually a third dimension. Um, Now, a book at the fourth level, not the concept, but the first principle itself, this really dialectical, flexible thing. A book can be my journal. It can have a circular ringed spine. Um, there are different kinds of books. There's a pop-up book. Some books have words, some books have pictures. Not all books are the same. The flexibility to go in and out of these different features where some have them and some don't is the dialectic. Um, it is the ability of the intuition to map onto different forms, quote unquote forms. The trick is, are these forms separately existing, or is it all a necessary growth of something we put them in a form somewhere else, or we put them in the mind, because empiricists really have struggled, I think, to throw them into the world. So for Deleuze, color, sound, relationality, all of these are part of the nature of the fabric of the matter itself. That's what a truly imminent reversal of Plato is. Sorry to read Plato while destroying him. I think the contrast is super helpful though. Um, that's true. This then is the kind of thing that on the one hand I said is intelligible, and on the other is such that the soul is forced to use hypotheses in the investigation of it, not traveling up to a first principle, since it cannot reach beyond its hypotheses, but using as images those very things of which images were made in the section below, and which by comparison to their images were thought to be clear and to be valued as such. And so honestly, I really see I keep criticizing him, but I really see Plato as saying that the dialectic does this, but I don't know why he goes to these like separately existing forms because I don't think that's right. Um, I think the dialectic points to matter itself having these features. I understand that you mean what happens in geometry and related sciences, although I think there's probably something very strange happening existentially with consciousness. Um, just in terms of what the long-term purpose is. Then also understand that by the other subsection of the intelligible, I mean that which reason itself grasps by the power of dialectic. It does not consider these hypotheses as first principles, but truly as hypotheses, but as stepping stones to take off from. So this is what I'm saying. The dialectic reverses it and takes it, should take it towards multiplicity, right? It should take it towards intuition. It should take it towards unity multiplicity. It should take it to the fact that the one is not truly just one, but the one is multiple. The one has all these dimensions and it can't be reduced to one. Um, I think there's a charitable way to read Plato. I also think there's a charitable way to read Descartes, very phenomenological Descartes. Flashing. It's kind of fun because I have branches outside my window, and then I have this like really tight-knit blind system in a cross stitch like this. Um, and it only just like lets light through. It restricts so much light that you need a strong presence of light on the other side to see anything that's happening. So I can't really see outside right now, but during the day I can. And yeah. But as stepping stones, having grasped this first principle, it reverses itself, like I said, reverses. And keeping hold of what follows from it comes down to a conclusion without making use of anything visible at all, but only of forms themselves, moving on from forms to forms and ending in forms. So for an eminent reading of Plato, things have forms. And we serialize and adumbrate the different forms that we've experienced, like I was showing you, different kinds of books. We serialize, we have multiple experiences, we connect them. We make a singularity out of what it means to be a book, something that flexibly fits these different experiences. But this adumbration is not a descendance from the universal good. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be transcendental. It doesn't have to be hierarchical. It doesn't have to be mastery, domination. I understand, if not yet adequately. But I think he gets the eidos right. I think he gets eidetics right. I think he gets mental um, fluidity and facility right. I think he's brilliant when it comes to the presentation of the conversation back and forth in all of his books. I understand, if not yet adequately, for in my opinion, you're speaking of an enormous task, that you want to distinguish the intelligible part of that which is the part studied by the science of dialectic as clearer than the part studied by the so-called sciences, for which their hypotheses are forced to do, for which their hypotheses are first principles. And although those who study the objects of these sciences are forced to do so by means of thought, rather than sense perception, it's not enough, right? That's what he's saying. Even though it's thought, it's not the right kind of thought. It's better than sense perception, but it's still repeating analysis in Bergson's terms. Let's not use Bergson's terms. Let's not repeat analysis. It's um, replicating. It's not a novel development of perception. It's not uh, living and vibrant consciousness. Okay. Although those who study the objects of these sciences are forced to do so by means of thought rather than sense perception, still, because they do not go back to a genuine first principle, but proceed from hypotheses, you don't think that they understand them, even though, given such a principle, they are intelligible. And you seem to me to call the state of the geometers thought, but not understanding, thought being intermediate between opinion and understanding. Your exposition is most adequate. The visuals really help here. But remember that recursive movement from partials to whole, from whole to concept of wholes, like from objects to concepts of objects, and then from concepts across concepts away from them to the dialectic itself, freed from any kind of necessity of first principle. Your exposition is most adequate. Thus, there are four such conditions in the soul, corresponding to the four subsections of our line: understanding for the highest, thought for the second, belief for the third, and imaging for the last. So that was in reverse order. Arrange them in a ratio and consider that each shares in clarity to the degree that the subsection it is set over shares in truth. I understand, agree, and arrange them as you say. It's pretty good. Pretty good. Um, so there's another little fun thing you can do with we might only have this episode, or we might be able to get through the main part of the cave with this episode. There's another like fun little thing that you can do with trying to understand the differences in perception and the mind, conception and forms, different degrees of forms, levels of form. Somewhere with concept. Well, no. No, it's all the way across all of them. The entire divided line is in the mind, right? And it's simultaneously an accurate latching into and locking into of two dual realms for Plato. The physical and the mental, or the physical and the ideal, the body and the mind. The identification with the perception of truth and truth itself. It's a unification, but it speaks not only to our ability to know truth, but it speaks to the veracity of what is being perceived, the givenness of what's there. The fun experiment, sorry. It's an aphantasia experiment. So the way it works is I ask you a question and you do what I ask. Um, it's not anything bad. I ask you to think of something. and you think of what I ask you to think of. And so I'll do it with a couple of different things so that you can see different levels. Because I think with some requests, people think of one thing, and with other requests, they think of another thing. So first, think of a ball. Okay. Think of a vehicle. Think of an animal. Think of a house. I listed lots of examples because hopefully, at least in one of these, you were able to come across something that you imagined a very specific thing for, um, and something that you imagined a very weird kind of blobby back and forth thing for. Maybe when I said one of them, you imagined, like when I said animal, I thought of something between Winchester, which is my German Shepherd, Sophia, who's my very large ragamuffin, fluffy gray and white cat. They're both assistance animals. Um, the horses that my mom has, she has paint mares, uh, and some other creatures. I was also kind of all navigating the form of all the forms too. So I was thinking about category, um, and how each of these things is a generalization that covers over and groups together a large number of sub things, subspecies within the category. Uh, for a ball, I don't really think of a ball. I think of like a sphere. It's does not have a color. It doesn't, it's like you could stick your hand through it. Um, it's like the topological representation of a mathematical sphere from the equation, whatever like that is. Like I don't know what the equation of a sphere is, but let me look that up. Topological sphere. This thing. This is what I think of. Because I've seen something like this before. I don't think of a sphere version, which seems really cool. I also don't think of a torus, because I put topological in here. Turn a sphere into anything else. Um, with the dialectic. What is the mathematical equation of the dialectic? So, yeah, that's what I think of. It doesn't have these like gray and white pixels behind it, but it's because my brain doesn't have those in it. It didn't really have these blue lines either. It didn't really have any of these lines. It was like clear, taking up that much space, but clear, but that thing. Um, and really, even this kind of sphere is not appropriate. Whoa. Wow. Um, I've never heard of Alexander's horn sphere. This is really cool. It's like a recursive nesting. This is wow. Super cool. Um, if you can't see my screen because you're on the audio version or whatever, just look up Alexander's horn sphere. Basically, so a torus is like a ring, um, like a donut. It's shaped like a donut. And Alexander's horn sphere, instead of it being a complete, well, it is complete. It's you cut it into a C, basically, And then at the ends, you make rings or horns, like a loop with a hole through it. And you put the loops through each other. But then you keep putting the loops, you keep doing that, and you keep kind of like knotting. Um, yeah, that's a good way to put it. You're knotting a torus indefinitely and recursively into smaller and tighter knots. And these visuals for it are really, really cool. Um, okay. Anyway, wait, so this is also a sphere. By the way, your dialectical understanding of sphere has to fit onto this thing. And knots. And so when you understand the topological transformation of a sphere into a torus, because topology is the study of transformations and specifically studying what properties hold consistent across transformations. So a question associated with the Alexander Horn sphere. Are there always inside and outside on 3D surfaces? This is really like one mathematical way, I think, of conceiving of the interlocking and interrelation of diverse substance and multiplicity. But sure, let's go back to Plato's forms because that's interesting. I think immanence is sick, man. That's why I like it. It's basically the original difference Klineman continually differentiating into more diversification and densifying while expanding. Okay. Um, some of my students imagine, when I say imagine a ball, they imagine like a red kickball. It's a very common one. Some of them imagine a football. I like the football example. A lot of them imagine a basketball, softball, baseball, golf ball, tennis ball, different colored kickball. Some of them just imagine a sphere that's a certain color. It's not necessarily a sports ball. Um, but I like the football. There's also I think it's badminton. Yeah. The badminton uses a shuttlecock, and the shuttlecock is shaped like I've never held one, so I don't know if it's it looks like it's a half sphere with like a set of feathers coming out in a fan, a circle fan, a circular fan. So you hit the half sphere that receives the hit, but it very quickly changes direction because of the weight of it, and then flies through the air in an aerodynamic way because of the feathers behind it. And then you keep catching it and hitting it over. I've never played. The important point is that it's a ball. And the dialectic is the fact that you understand it's a ball. It's not just a concept. You can't just say the ball is concept because it's not the same concept to start with every time. It has to flex about across these different experiences. And that's what the most true thing is. It's not starting with some first hypothesis. It's not starting with a concept. It's being able to enter upon a different experience, have the intuition mold upon the substance and see if it fits. And if it fits, if there's an aesthetic resonance, a coherence. Coherence is an important word here. If there's a coherence, then it's appropriate. Because it's a dialectical understanding, it's a dialectical development, and you can never shut down the dialectic. Kant wanted to put an end to metaphysics, and it's just like there's always something else to do. So with the cave, for example, which is what we're about to do, even the philosopher who has left the cave. So this cave is a situation in which you don't know things. It's a state of ignorance, and you leave the cave. It's another series of reflections and shadows and falsehoods, and like the real truth makes the shadow, and you think the shadow is truth, and then you find what was causing the shadow, and you realize, oh, that's actually how things are working. And then that happens again. You're like, oh, that's actually how things are working. And then you realize the originals were also shadows. And then you find the real shadows. Oh, that's actually, it keeps happening. Anyway, even the philosopher that leaves after all of this and sees the sun finally, perhaps there is some end to it. They must go back in the cave. The point is not to just stay with the sun, to stay with the truth and personal reflection. They must go back into the cave, even if it means being laughed at, even if it means being in competition with people who are playing shadow games with puppets. Plato says that they're competing to see who can remember the order of which puppets come after which. And what were their names? And what colors were they? And what shapes were they? Good memory. Good job. You win a prize. You get some money. You get some awards. A whole life just playing with shadows that don't mean anything, that aren't access to truth, that aren't, I mean, it's almost a mystical religious experience. It could be any religion that you want it to be. Um, it's what is truly gratifying, whatever that is, right? Philosophers think it's studying what it means to be a good person, for the most part, and making the world better, and coming to terms with death. The point is, when you go back into the cave and you take the ridicule of the shadow games, you're actually reenacting the henosis with the dialectic. And so you're experiencing new iterations of explanation and understanding, new translations, new developments, new adumbrations. You get asked new questions, you hit new problems, you overcome them in new ways. You put it in painting, you put it in music, you put it in poetry. You talk about grief this way, you talk about grief that way. You talk about love this way. You talk about raising a family. You talk about what it means to lose a family member. The dialectic goes on. It's all connected and it's all different. And it's just good. It's worth doing over and over again. It's more worth doing than accumulating money. It's worth growing, learning, contributing, but just accumulating stuff isn't worth what the dialectic is worth. So we have about 10 minutes left in this episode. I mean, we're at 40. The last one was at 40. We cut the last one at 40. We've already started talking about the cave, so I want to read it. The question is, how is the instrument or organ of learning revealed through the allegory of the cave? And this is that originally they're constrained to look at the shadows and they have to turn to look at the proper source of truth. Truth It's not something that you give to people. It's not a set of facts or propositions that you know. It's just helping them turn in the right way. And so it's letting them practice it themselves. Education is about student practice and teacher practice, but it's not a depositing of knowledge. Think of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who, you know, maybe I'll have time at some point to do like a set of like optional excerpts. I don't teach his text explicitly, but I listed it. I have a few pages that I try to include in the beginning of class as um, a tone setter for student freedom in my classes. All right. Book 7, The Cave. I will go through quite a few pages. Um, so after this is when I would recommend going and watching that Orson Welles video. Big warning. If you have epilepsy, that video has a lot of flashing lights. Um, it might distract you. It might cause seizures. So just be careful. It's the sun, getting out and seeing the truth or the good. The sun, the good, the one, God, whatever. Uh, that's when there's the big flashing. So, sorry, I had a yawn. Next, I said, compare the effect of education and of the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets. I'm imagining it. Then also imagine that there are people along the wall carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it. Statues of people and other animals, made out of stone, wood, and every material. And as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent. It's a strange image you're describing. And strange prisoners, they're like us. Do you suppose, first of all, that these prisoners see anything of themselves and one another, besides the shadows of the fire cast on the wall in front of them because their heads are locked? How could they if they have to keep their heads motionless throughout life? What about the things being carried along the wall? Isn't the same true of them? Of course. And if they could talk to one another, don't you think they'd suppose the names they used apply to things they see passing before them? They'd have to, instead of the original sources of the things, the real things, not the shadows and images and reflections and partials or elementals. And what if their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? Don't you think they'd believe that the shadows passing in front of them were talking whenever one of the carriers passing along the wall was doing so? I certainly do. Then the prisoners would in every way believe that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts. They must surely believe that. Consider then what being released from their bonds and cured of their ignorance would naturally be like if something like this came to pass. When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled, and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential, but that now, because he's a bit closer to the things that are like the shadows were inconsequential, because he is now a bit closer to the things that are and is turned towards things that are more, he sees more correctly? Or to put it another way, if we pointed to each of the things passing by, asked him what each of them is, and compelled him to answer, don't you think he'd be at a loss and that he'd believe that the things he saw earlier were truer than the ones he was now being shown, much truer? And if someone compelled him to look at the light himself, wouldn't his eyes hurt, and wouldn't he turn around and flee towards the things he's able to see, believing that they're really clearer than the ones he's being shown? He would. And if someone dragged him away from there by force up the rough, steep path and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of the things now said to be true? He would be unable to see them, at least at first. I suppose, then, that he'd need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above. At first, he'd see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water, then the things themselves. Of these, he'd be able to study the things in the sky and the sky itself more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon, than during the day, looking at the sun and the light of the sun. Of course. So again, kind of going from shadows to originals and then shadows to originals, go from reflections, from shadows to reflections in water, and then to the night sky, and then to the sunlight, the daylight sky. Finally, I suppose he'd be able to see the sun, not images of it in water or some alien place, but the sun itself, in its own place, and be able to study it. Necessarily so. And at this point, he would infer and conclude that the sun provides the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some way the cause of all the things that he used to see. So that's what the good does, right? That's what the ultimate understanding of the absolute one truth does. It's clear that would be his next step. What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there? Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for the change and pity the others? Certainly. And if there had been any honors, praises, or prizes among them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and who best remembered which usually came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, and who could thus best divine the future, because pattern recognition of random, meaningless stuff. Do you think that our man would desire these rewards or envy those among the prisoners who were honored and held power? Instead, wouldn't he feel with Homer that he'd much prefer to work the earth, to quote, work the earth as a serf to another, one without possessions, end quote, and go through any sufferings rather than share their opinions and live as they do? I suppose he would rather suffer anything than live like that. Consider this too. If this man went down into the cave again and sat down in the same seat, wouldn't his eyes, coming suddenly out of the sun like that, be filled with darkness? So, two directions, right? If you go from darkness to light, you have to adjust because you're used to looking in the dark and everything is just really bright. And if you go from really bright to dark, you're not used to looking in the dark. You're used to seeing things really bright, so everything's really dark. Um, They certainly would. And before his eyes had recovered, and the adjustment would not be quick, while his vision was still dim, if he had to compete again with the perpetual prisoners in recognizing the shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd returned from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and that it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upward? What they say of all philosophers. And as for anyone who tried to free them and lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? They certainly would. This whole image Glaucon must be fitted together with what we said before. The visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside it to the power of the sun. And if you interpret the upward journey and the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm, you'll grasp what I hope to convey, since that is what you wanted to hear about. Whether it's true or not, only the God knows, but this is how I see it. In the noble realm, the form of the good is the last thing to be seen, and it is reached only with difficulty. Once one has seen it, however, one must conclude that it is the cause of all that is correct and beautiful in anything, that it produces both light and its source in the visible realm, and that in the intelligible realm, it controls and provides truth and understanding so that anyone who is to act sensibly in private or public must see it. So that's relating the good with the sun, right? The dialectic is the travel back and forth, up and down, though, up and down the divided line. I have the same thought, at least as far as I'm able. Come then, share with me this thought also. It isn't surprising that the ones who get to this point are unwilling to occupy themselves with human affairs, and that their souls are always pressing upwards, eager to spend their time above, for after all, this is surely what we'd expect, if indeed things fit the image I described before. Guilty as charged, guys. I like philosophy. It is. What about what happens when someone turns from divine study to the evils of human life? Do you think it's surprising, since his sight is still dim and he hasn't yet become accustomed to the darkness around him, that he behaves awkwardly and appears completely ridiculous if he's compelled, either in the courts or elsewhere, to contend about the shadows of justice or the statues, of which they are the shadows, and to dispute about the way these things are understood by people who have never seen justice itself in the sun above, the absolute one good? That's not surprising at all. No, it isn't. But anyone with any understanding would remember the eyes may be confused in two ways and from two causes, namely when they've come from the light into the darkness, and when they've come from the darkness into the light. Realizing that the same applies to the soul, when someone sees a soul disturbed and unable to see something, he won't laugh mindlessly, but he'll take into consideration whether it has come from a brighter life and is dimmed through not having yet become accustomed to the dark, or whether it has come from greater ignorance and a greater light, and is dazzled by the increased brilliance. Then he'll declare the first soul happy in its experience in life, and he'll pity the latter. But even if he chose to make fun of it, at least he'd be less ridiculous than if he laughed at a soul that has come from the light above. What you say is very reasonable. If that's true, then here's what we must think about these matters. Education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. They do say that. But our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. This instrument cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it's able to study that which is that which is, and the brightest thing that is, namely, the one we call the good. Isn't that right? Yes. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look. And it tries to redirect it appropriately, so it seems. Now it looks as though the other so-called virtues of the soul are akin to those of the body, but they really aren't there beforehand, but are added later by habit and practice. However, the virtue of reason seems to belong above all to something more divine, which never loses its power, but is either useful and beneficial or useless and harmful, depending on the way it is turned. Or have you never noticed this about people who are said to be vicious but clever, how keen the vision of their little souls is, and how sharply it distinguishes the things that it is turned towards? This shows that its sight isn't inferior, but rather is forced to serve evil ends, so the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. Absolutely. However, if a nature of this sort had been hammered at from childhood and freed from the bonds of kinship with becoming, so the fleeting transitory nature of the world is what Plato means when he says becoming, the bonds of kinship with becoming, the attachment to the impermanence, which have been fastened to it by feasting, greed, and other such pleasures, and which, like leaden weights, pull its vision downwards, if, being rid of these, it turned to look at true things, then I say that the same soul of the same person would see these most sharply, just as it now does the things it is presently turned towards. Probably so. And what about the uneducated who have no experience of truth? Isn't it likely, indeed, doesn't it follow necessarily from what was said before, they will never adequately govern a city? But neither would those who've been allowed to spend their whole lives being educated, the opposite extreme. The former would fail because they don't have a single goal at which all their actions, public and private, inevitably aim, the ones who are uneducated. The overeducated, the latter, would fail because they'd refuse to act, thinking that they had settled while still alive in the faraway isles of the blessed. That's true. It is our task as founders, then, to compel the best natures to reach the study we said before is the most important, namely to make the ascent and see the good. But when they've made it and looked sufficiently, we mustn't allow them to do what they're allowed to do today. What's that? To stay there and refuse to go down again to the prisoners in the cave and show their labors and honors, whether they are of less worth or of greater. So they're not allowed to do it, but also by going back into the cave, they reactivate the dialectic. They find it in new ways. They get the one in new ways. And the one will be better and different when they come back to it, if they do, or if they've ever left it. Then are we to do them an injustice by making them live a worse life when they could live a better one? You are forgetting again that it isn't the law's concern to make any one class in the city outstandingly happy, but to contrive to spread happiness throughout the city by bringing the citizens into harmony with each other through persuasion or compulsion, and by making them share with each other the benefits that each class can confer on the community. The law produces such people in the city not in order to allow them to turn in whatever direction they want, but to make use of them to bind the city together. That's true. I had forgotten. Observe then, Glaucon, that we won't be doing an injustice to those who've become philosophers in our city, and that what we'll say to them when we compel them to guard and care for the others will be just. We'll say, when people like you come to be in other cities, they're justified in not sharing in their city's labors, for they've grown there spontaneously against the will of the Constitution. And what grows of its own accord and owes no debt for its upbringing has justice on its side when it isn't keen to pay anyone for that upbringing. But we've made you kings in our city and leaders of the swarm, as it were, both for yourselves and for the rest of the city. You're better and more completely educated than the others and are better able to share in both types of life. Therefore, each of you in turn must go down to live in the common dwelling place of the others and grow accustomed to seeing in the dark. When you are used to it, you'll see vastly better than the people there. And because you've seen the truth about fine, just, and good things, you'll know each image for what it is, and also that of which it is just the image. Thus, for you and for us, the city will be governed, not like the majority of cities nowadays, but people who fight over shadows and struggle against one another in order to rule, as if that were a great good, but by people who are awake rather than dreaming. For the truth is surely this: a city whose prospective rulers are least eager to rule must of necessity be most free from civil war, whereas a city with the opposite kind of rulers is governed in the opposite way. Absolutely. Then do you think that those we've nurtured will disobey us and refuse to share the labors of the city, each in turn, while living the greater part of their time with one another in the pure realm? It is impossible, for we'll be giving just orders to just people. Each of them will certainly go to rule as to something compulsory, however, which is exactly the opposite of what's done by those who now rule in each city. This is how it is. If you can find a way of life that's better than ruling for the prospective rulers, your well-governed city will become a possibility. For only in it will the truly rich rule, not those who are rich in gold, but those who are rich in the wealth that the happy must have, namely, a good and rational life. But if beggars, hungry for private goods, go into public life, thinking that the good is there for the seizing, then the well-governed city is impossible, for then ruling is something fought over, and the civil and domestic war destroys these people and the rest of the city as well. So what he says is that the philosopher can't be a philosopher unless their city is run by a philosopher. And if all the philosophers are not running cities, then pretty soon nobody gets to do it. That's very true. Can you name any life that despises political rule besides that of the true philosopher? He's also saying that you need somebody who doesn't want to be in charge to be in charge in order to allow a peaceable spaciousness that would allow philosophy to take place, right? Um, no, by God, I can't think of anybody who doesn't want to rule besides that of the philosopher, and also the only one who can do it. But surely it is those who are not lovers of ruling who must rule, for if they don't, the lovers of it who are rivals will fight over it. Of course. Then who will you compel to become guardians of the city, if not those who have the best understanding of what matters for good government, and who have other honors than political ones, and a better life as well? No one. Do you want us to consider, do you want us to consider now how such people will come to be in our city, and how, Just as some are said to have gone up from Hades to the gods will lead them up to the light? Of course I do. This isn't, it seems, a matter of tossing a coin, but of turning the soul from a day that is a kind of night to the true day, the ascent to what is, which we say is true philosophy. Indeed. Then mustn't we try to discover the subjects that have the power to bring this about? Of course. So this is, I think, where he's going to switch to talking about the education. So what subject is it, Glaucon, that draws the soul from the realm of becoming to the realm of what is? And it occurs to me as I'm speaking that we said, didn't we, that it is necessary for the prospective rulers, excuse me, to be athletes in war when they're young. Yes, we did. Then the subject we're looking for must also have this characteristic in addition to the former one. Which one? It mustn't be useless to warlike men. If it's at all possible, it mustn't. Now, prior to this, we educated them in music and poetry and physical training. Um, I think I'm just going to skip to the stuff that I want to talk about because we're at an hour. Um, so summoners. Some sense perceptions don't summon the understanding to look into them because the judgment of sense perception is itself adequate, so they're not confusing to us. While others encourage it in every way to look into them because sense perception seems to produce no sound result, meaning that you get contradictory things from different senses. You're obviously referring to things appearing in the distance and to Trompe l'oeil paintings. You're not quite getting it in my meaning. Then what do you mean? The ones that don't summon the understanding at all are all those that don't go off into opposite perceptions at the same time. But the ones that do go off in that way, I call summoners. Whatever sense perceptions don't declare one thing any more than its opposite, no matter whether the object striking the senses is near at hand or far away. You'll understand my meaning better if I put it this way. These we say are three fingers, the smallest, the second, and the middle finger. Um, so the fingers don't contradict any perception. Like he holds up three fingers and says they don't contradict any perception of like what the fingers are because they're not multiple things at the same time. Um, hardness and softness seem to be contradictory because they're just different degrees of the same perception. Bigness and smallness also different degrees of the same form. Those that strike the relevant sense at the same time as their opposites I call summoners. Those that don't do this do not awaken understanding. And like I said, um, at the end of book 7, he talks about, let's just go down to it. So he does say that women can be philosopher queens. They can be rulers in charge despite his sexism elsewhere. Um, so lawfulness has to go through lawlessness. Sorry. Lawness has to go through lawlessness. Lawfulness has to go through lawlessness. Um, so he's talking about this process of growing up and, You start out with like we were talking about the soul earlier, right? Courage and habit. And you use courage to carry on the habits of your parents. So he's considering a child who comes up with the habits of their parents, takes on new experiences, suffers, fails, realizes those habits are appropriate, and then takes them back up. There are other ways of living, however, opposite to these and full of pleasures that flatter the soul and attract it to themselves, but which don't persuade sensible people who continue to honor and obey the convictions of their fathers. That's right. And then a questioner comes along and asks someone of this sort, what is the fine? Like what is the good? What is the just? And when he answers what he has heard from the traditional lawgiver, the argument refutes him, and by refuting him often and in many places, shakes him from his convictions and makes him believe that the fine is no more fine than shameful, and the same with the just, the good, and the things he honored most. So the dialectic undoes common understanding. Um, what do you what do you think his attitude will be to honoring and obeying his earlier convictions? Of necessity, he won't honor or obey them in the same way. Then, when he no longer honors and obeys those convictions and can't discover the true ones, will he be likely to adopt any other way of life than that which flatters him? No, he won't. And so, I suppose, from being law-abiding, he becomes lawless. Well, this is because of a conflation in what they mean by law here. It says inevitably, but law is something given by the soul. Law is not following the fears of your fathers. Law is having that in the soul yourself. Then, as I asked before, isn't it only to be expected that this is what happens to those who take up arguments in this way, and don't they therefore deserve a lot of sympathy? So this says dialectics must pass through lawlessness to find the law of the universal reason of the intellect. Yes, and they deserve pity too. Then, if you don't want your 30-year-olds to be objects of such pity, you'll have to be extremely careful about how you introduce them to arguments. That's right. And isn't it one lasting precaution not to let them taste arguments while they're young? I don't suppose that it has escaped your notice that when young people get their first taste of arguments, they misuse it by treating it as a kind of game of contradiction. It's so, I think impious is the word I'm looking for. It's just kind of like unimpressively shallow, um, deviant for the sake of deviance without having any substance. Not impious, but like impish. A game of contradiction. They imitate those who've refuted them by refuting others themselves. And like puppies, they enjoy dragging and tearing those around them with their arguments. They're excessively fond of it. Then, when they've refuted many and been refuted by them in turn, they forcefully and quickly fall into disbelieving what they believed before. And as a result, they themselves and the whole of philosophy are discredited in the eyes of others. That's very true. But an older person won't want to take part in such madness. He'll imitate someone who is willing to engage in discussion in order to look for the truth. So you have to believe, despite the contradiction, despite the tearing apart, you have to believe that truth is still possible. In order to look for the truth rather than someone who plays at contradiction for sport. He'll be more sensible himself and will bring honor rather than discredit to the philosophical way of life. That's right. And when we said before that those allowed to take part in arguments should be orderly and steady by nature, not as nowadays when even the unfit are allowed to engage in them, wasn't all that also said as a precaution? Of course. Then if someone continuously, strenuously, and exclusively devotes himself to participation in arguments, exercising himself in them just as he did in the bodily physical training, which is their counterpart, would that be enough? Do you mean 6 years or 4? It doesn't matter. Make it 5. And after that, you must make them go down into the cave again, and compel them to take command in matters of war and occupy the other offices suitable for young people, so that they won't be inferior to the others in experience. But in these two, they must be tested to see whether they'll remain steadfast when they're pulled this way and that or shift their ground. How much time do you allow for that? 15 years. Then at the age of 50, so from 30 to 35, I'm about to turn 30, fun, Maybe I'm in my 5-year philosophy study period where I'm up with the sun doing things. And then I go back in the cave. Yay. 35 is the age. Um, he says take professional office. 35 is the age you can become president of the United States. But I think he leaves the philosopher queen and philosopher king position for the age of 50. Then at the age of 50, those who've survived the tests and been successful both in practical matters and in the sciences must be led to the goal and compelled to lift up the radiant light of their souls to what itself provides light for everything. And once they've seen the good itself, they must each in turn put the city, its citizens, and themselves in order, using it as their model. Each of them will spend most of his time with philosophy, but when his turn comes, he must labor in politics and rule for the city's sake, not as if he were doing something fine, but rather something that has to be done. Then, having educated others like himself to take his place as guardians of the city, he will depart for the Isles of the Blessed and dwell there. And if the Pythia agrees, the city will publicly establish memorials and sacrifices to him as a daemon. But if not, or like a voice of wisdom, but if not, then as a happy and divine human being. Like a sculptor, Socrates, you've produced ruling men that are completely fine, excellent, virtuous, just, good, precise. And ruling women too, Glaucon, for you mustn't think that what I've said applies any more to men than it does to women who are born with the appropriate natures. That's right, if indeed they are to share everything equally with the men, as we said they should. Then do you agree that the things we've said about the city and its constitution aren't altogether wishful thinking? That it's hard for them to come about, but not impossible? And do you also agree that they can come about only in the way we indicated, namely when one or more true philosophers come to power in a city, who despise present honors, thinking them slavish and worthless, and who prize what is right and the honors that come from it above everything, and regard justice as the most important and most essential thing, serving it and increasing it as they set their city in order. How will they do that? They'll send everyone in the city who is over 10 years old into the country. Then they'll take possession of the children who are now free from the ethos of their parents and bring them up in their own customs and laws, which are the ones we've described. This is the quickest and easiest way for the city and constitution we've discussed to be established, become happy, and bring most benefits to the people among whom it's established. Fun fact, you guys. Vladimir Lenin says this is how you institute class consciousness into the citizens and get the capitalist fascism out. Um, You just have to reset the education system. And after a few generations of continually progressing the education, like aggressively progressing the youth education in the right direction, you cleanse the system. That can be done for better or for worse. It can be regressive. It can make individuals less intelligent, less capable, because the city is afraid of perhaps were the average person to be more empowered, and the upper class would not have as many resources left to themselves. Huh. I wonder why they would want to control that and prevent that. They'll take possession of the children who are now free from the ethos of their parents. Plato's words, right? And bring them up in their own customs and laws, which are the ones we've described. This is the quickest and easiest way for the city and constitution we've discussed to be established, become happy, and bring most benefit to the people among whom it's established. That's by far the quickest and easiest way, and in my opinion, Socrates, you described well how it would come into being, if it ever did. Then, isn't that enough about the city and the man who is like it? Surely it is clear what sort of man we'll say he has to be. It is clear, he said. And as for your question, I think we have reached the end of this topic. I want to add here a phrase that Deleuze puts in Eminence of Life. Eminence of Life is all about the relation of the first person conscious perspective to the rest of the world. Um, particularly sort of a rogue figure who is saved at the brink of death. And in that, there is only, there is not, Deleuze says something like there is not individual life playing with individual death, but there is a life playing with universal death. Um, Something to that effect. And another phrase that's just really lovely is it says that there's no this isn't a lesson on Deleuze, but um between his life and his death, there is a moment that is only that of a life playing with death. The life of the individual gives way to an impersonal and yet singular life that releases a pure event, freed from the accidents of internal and external life, that is, from the subjectivity and objectivity of what happens. The life of such individuality fades away in favor of the singular life, immanent to a man who no longer has a name, though he can be mistaken for no other, a singular essence, a life. And then going back to Plato, what Plato just said, um, then isn't that enough about this city and the man who is like it? Surely it is clear what sort of man we'll say he has to be. Maybe like the Tao in Taoism, maybe just by getting your own character and virtue right, you produce a realm of purity and stability around you. Sort of Pure Land Buddhism. It is clear, he said, and as for your question, I think we have reached the end of this topic. Well, folks, I am from Texas. That was not a fake accent. It just was me kind of, I don't know. I actually have worked my accent out of my voice. Winchester, he's in bed. I'm not going to make him pay the tax. He doesn't want to get up. But thanks for being here, guys. Um, yeah, I appreciate it. Hope you're having a good week. Catch the next podcast, catch the next video, catch the next lecture, catch the next exam. Kidding. Some of you do have exams coming up. Let me know if you need anything. If you're one of my students, if you want to leave a comment on the video, that's totally fine. Um, yeah. Bye.